There's a place in the Amazon where the water never fully retreats, where the trees grow with their roots submerged for months at a time, their bark soft and waterlogged, their trunks slowly being hollowed out from the inside. And inside those trunks, deep in the wet, dark wood, lives one of the most unusual sources of food on the entire planet. Something that most people in the world would walk right past without ever suspecting it was there. Something that communities along the Amazon River have been harvesting, preparing, and eating for centuries. If you have never heard of the Turu before, you are about to have a very interesting day. The Amazon basin is not what most people imagine when they think of food. They picture mangoes falling from trees, fish jumping out of the river, maybe some kind of exotic fruit growing on a vine. And yes, all of that exists. But the Amazon is also a place of deep scarcity in certain regions, where the forest is dense and the dry goods expensive, where a family living along a river channel might go days without protein if the fishing is bad and the market is far. In those conditions, people learn to look for food in places that nobody else thought to look. And one of those places was inside the trees themselves. The Turu is not actually a worm, though it looks like one. It is a bivalve mollusk, a relative of clams and oysters, belonging to the family Pteridinidae. These creatures are sometimes called shipworms in English because, for centuries, sailors knew them as the organisms that destroyed wooden ships from the inside out, boring tunnels through submerged timber and causing hulls to collapse. In the Amazon, the same biological process happens in the fallen and partially submerged trees of the Várzea, the floodplain forest that lines the rivers and channels of the region. The Turu bores into the wood as a tiny larva, then grows inside the tunnel it creates, feeding on the cellulose of the tree itself. By the time it is mature, it can reach lengths of 30 centimeters or more. Pale, soft, cylindrical, with two small shells at its head end that it uses to scrape and tunnel. It looks, to the untrained eye, exactly like an enormous white worm living inside a piece of rotting wood, and for the communities that know it, it is one of the most valuable foods the forest offers. The process of finding and harvesting Turu is not something you can do casually. You need to know what you are looking for. The trees that host Turu are usually species like the Aninga and the Yucuba, trees that grow along the water's edge and frequently have their lower trunks submerged during the flood season. A tree that has been colonized by Turu will show small entry holes along its waterlogged surface, little marks in the bark that look almost like pinpricks. If you press the wood and it feels soft, almost spongy, that is another sign. Experienced harvesters can walk along the riverbank and read these signs the way a carpenter reads the grain of wood. They know which trees are worth opening and which ones are empty. When they find a promising trunk, they use a machete or an axe to split it open. And what they find inside can be genuinely shocking to someone who has never seen it before. The interior of the wood is not solid anymore. It has been replaced by a network of tunnels, each one lined with a thin, white shell-like coating, each one containing a single Turu. In a heavily colonized trunk, there can be dozens of them, maybe more, pale and glistening in the sudden light, moving slowly in the wet wood. The smell is strong, something between the sea and the forest, briny and organic, and completely unlike anything you would encounter in a supermarket. The harvesters work quickly, using their fingers to pull the Turu from the tunnels, collecting them in bowls or buckets. Moving from tunnel to tunnel with the practiced speed of people who have done this their entire lives. What happens next depends entirely on who is doing the cooking. Some communities eat the Turu raw, directly from the tree, the way you might eat a raw oyster. The texture is soft and gelatinous, the flavor intensely oceanic, rich with minerals, and with something almost sweet underneath. People who have tried it this way and who approach it without the barrier of disgust describe it as genuinely good, briny and clean, like the best shellfish you have ever had, but stranger, wilder, more alive tasting. Others squeeze lemon juice over the raw Turu before eating it, a practice that mirrors the way people eat raw oysters and clams across the world, using the acid to brighten the flavor and add a familiar sharpness to something deeply unfamiliar. But the most common preparation, and the one that has traveled farthest from the riverbank into the broader culture of Amazonian cooking, is to cook the Turu in its own liquid. When the creatures are removed from the wood, they release a cloudy, milky fluid that is essentially a concentrated broth of everything they have been feeding on: digested wood, filtered river water, their own biological fluids. This liquid, which sounds deeply unappealing when described that way, is actually extraordinary when cooked. Communities along the Amazon collect the Turu and their liquid together, sometimes adding garlic, hot pepper, lime juice, salt, and fresh herbs, and cook everything together in a pot until the liquid reduces into something thick and fragrant. The result is served over rice or farofa, the toasted cassava flour that is a staple across Brazil, and eaten as a complete meal. The Turu themselves become tender and mild when cooked, losing some of their raw intensity and taking on the flavors of whatever aromatics were added to the pot. There is also a version where the Turu are cooked inside the wood itself, a preparation that is almost ritualistic in its simplicity. The trunk is placed over an open fire, and the heat slowly cooks the creatures inside their own tunnels, steaming in the moisture of the wood. When the trunk is split open after cooking, the Turu inside are ready to eat, infused with the flavor of the charred wood and their own steam. This technique requires almost no equipment and produces something that people in the region describe as having a smoky, complex flavor that is completely impossible to replicate any other way. Now, before you dismiss this as something exotic and irrelevant, it is worth understanding what the Turu actually represents from a nutritional standpoint, because the science here is genuinely interesting. Researchers who have analyzed the composition of Turu have found that it is exceptionally high in protein, containing levels comparable to conventional shellfish like clams and mussels. It is also rich in lipids, including fatty acids that are associated with cardiovascular health, and contains significant amounts of minerals including iron, zinc, and calcium. For communities living in areas with limited access to conventional protein sources, the Turu is not a curiosity or a last resort. It is a serious, nutritious food that the forest provides in abundance at certain times of year, requiring no farming, no feeding, no infrastructure of any kind. The tree does all the work, the forest provides. The community harvests. This is something that comes up again and again when you study the traditional food systems of the Amazon. The things that look strange or shocking from the outside are often, when you examine them closely, expressions of a deep and sophisticated ecological knowledge. The people who eat Turu are not eating it because they have no other options. They are eating it because they know something that most of the world does not. That the forest is full of food if you know how to read it, and that some of the most nutritious and flavorful things available grow in the places that nobody else thinks to. Look, the Turu has been part of the food culture of Amazonian, indigenous, and riverine communities for as long as those communities have existed. It appears in the oral histories of multiple indigenous groups as a food associated with certain seasons and certain kinds of forest. It is mentioned in the accounts of early European explorers and naturalists who traveled through the Amazon basin and noted, with varying degrees of disgust and fascination, that the local populations ate creatures found inside waterlogged wood. Charles Waterton, the 19th century naturalist, wrote about shipworms as food in his accounts of South American travel. Alfred Russel Wallace, who spent years in the Amazon before developing his theory of natural selection alongside Darwin, documented indigenous food practices that almost certainly included Turu, or similar organisms. These were not isolated incidents. They were observations of a continuous, living food tradition that predated European contact by thousands of years and has continued uninterrupted into the present day. In more recent decades, the Turu has begun to attract attention beyond the communities that have always known it. Brazilian researchers studying food security and biodiversity have pointed to traditional forest foods like Turu as examples of the kind of sustainable, low-impact protein sources that could become increasingly important as conventional animal agriculture faces growing environmental criticism. The Turu requires no land clearing, produces no greenhouse gases, consumes no fresh water, and leaves no waste. It is, by almost any environmental metric, an extraordinarily efficient food. Some researchers have suggested that the harvesting of Turu and similar organisms from naturally occurring populations could be formalized and studied as a model for sustainable food production in tropical regions. There's also a cultural dimension to this that deserves attention. The Turu is not just a food in the communities where it is eaten. It is a social object, something that structures relationships and practices and seasonal rhythms. The harvest of Turu is typically a communal activity, something that groups of people do together, moving along the riverbank and working the wood, sharing the labor and the knowledge. The preparation and eating of Turu is embedded in the domestic and social life of these communities in ways that go far beyond simple nutrition. There are families where the recipe for cooking Turu has been passed down from grandmother to granddaughter across multiple generations, each one adding her own adjustments, a little more lime, a different pepper, a specific herb that grows only in certain places along the river. The food carries memory and identity in the way that all traditional foods do, connecting the people who eat it to the place and the time and the people who came before them. And yet, outside of the Amazon, and particularly outside of Brazil, almost nobody knows that the Turu exists. It does not appear in international food media. It is not on any restaurant menu outside of a very small number of places in Belém and Manaus that serve traditional Amazonian cuisine. It has not been featured in the kind of food travel programming that brings unusual ingredients to global attention. It exists in a kind of informational shadow, known deeply and intimately by the people who depend on it, and completely invisible to everyone else. That invisibility is part of a broader pattern in the way the world thinks about food from poor and remote communities. The foods that sustain people in places without economic or cultural power tend to be ignored until someone with a platform discovers them and translates them into a format that the global food media finds acceptable. Sometimes that process of discovery and translation is respectful and enriching. Sometimes it is extractive and reductive, stripping the food of its context and presenting it as a novelty rather than as what it actually is, the accumulated knowledge of generations of people who understood their environment with a depth and precision that most of us cannot imagine. The Turu deserves better than that. It deserves to be understood on its own terms, as a sophisticated expression of ecological knowledge and culinary creativity, as a food that has sustained human life in one of the most biodiverse and complex environments on Earth, as a living tradition that connects communities to their landscape and to each other. The fact that it looks strange to people who have never seen it, the fact that it comes from inside a rotting log in a swamp, the fact that it moves and glistens and smells of the deep river, none of that makes it lesser. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. Because the people who look at a waterlogged tree in a flooded forest and see not decay but abundance, not obstacle but food, not strangeness but sustenance, those people understand something fundamental about the relationship between human beings and the natural world that most of us have forgotten entirely. And every time someone splits open a trunk along the Amazon and reaches inside for what lives there, that understanding is kept alive for one more generation.